Morning arrived softly over the Apache camp, the sun casting warm gold across the teepees and the rocky landscape beyond. Ethan Cole awoke to the sound of quiet murmurs, the smell of cooking fires, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Nayeli was already awake, sitting near a small fire with a bowl of water and roasted corn, her dark eyes watching him. She smiled faintly, calling him husband once more in her soft musical language. Ethan felt a strange mix of confusion and respect. He had never thought he would wake up as a part of someone else's life, let alone in a culture so different from his own. But there was no turning back now. The choices had been made, and he had to act with honor. He rose carefully, brushing the dust from his clothes, and tried to communicate with her using simple words and gestures. Nayeli responded with patience, pointing to the food, showing him how to eat with his hands in the way her people did, and occasionally repeating a word in English she had picked up from him. It was slow, often awkward, but there was warmth in their exchange. Ethan realized that words were only part of understanding. Actions, gestures, and shared experience could speak even more clearly. The first few days were filled with small lessons. Ethan helped repair the leather saddles used for horses, taught the young men how to tie knots and make simple tools, and even assisted in gathering firewood. The tribe watched him with quiet scrutiny, testing whether he was worthy of trust. He noticed their deep connection to the land, how they moved silently, how they understood the flow of water, the tracks of animals, the rhythm of the wind. It was unlike anything he had experienced in the open plains of his ranching life, and yet there was a sense of harmony here that called to him. Slowly, the tribe began to accept him not as an outsider, but as one who had proven himself by courage and compassion. During the day, Nayeli and Ethan found moments to connect beyond necessity. They sat by the creek, watching the sunlight dance on the water, or walked among the sagebrush and small pines, learning the names of plants and stones in each other's language. She taught him how to find edible roots, and he showed her how to make small leather pouches. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, letting the wind carry their thoughts. Ethan discovered something in himself he had never known, a growing affection for this brave, quiet girl who had trusted him so completely. He respected her courage, her fierce pride, and the way she faced the world even when wounded. He also realized that her culture had rules he could not fully understand yet, rules built on generations of tradition and survival. But respect and patience, he thought, were the first steps toward understanding. One afternoon, a group of cavalry riders appeared on the horizon. They moved in formation, eyes scanning the land, rifles resting at the ready. Panic tightened Ethan's chest. He knew they were not looking for a friendly visit. They were likely searching for stolen horses or investigating the presence of any white men in the area. He glanced at Nayeli, who had already tensed. Her tribe watched silently, their hands resting near weapons. Ethan understood immediately the danger. If these men saw him with the Apache, they might believe he was a captive or an enemy, and blood could be shed. He stepped forward slowly, raising his hands in peace. "I'm not here to fight," he called, hoping they could understand. The riders halted, confused and cautious. A tense moment stretched over the land. The tribe's chief, Taji, stepped forward as well, his calm authority radiating to everyone around. Ethan motioned toward him, trying to indicate respect for the chief and the people who had given him shelter. The cavalry whispered among themselves, unsure what to do. The desert held its breath, waiting for a decision. Finally, the riders lowered their weapons slightly, but suspicion remained. One of them shouted that the white man should leave immediately, his voice carrying across the canyon walls. Ethan, knowing that leaving could mean betrayal of the trust given to him by the tribe, spoke clearly, though his words were simple. "These people saved me. I stay by choice." The words carried weight, not just to the soldiers, but to the tribe and himself. He was no longer merely a man passing through. He was a part of something bigger, bound by honor and gratitude. That night, after the soldiers had left, the tribe gathered around the fire, their faces glowing in the flickering light. Taji, the chief, spoke to Ethan in their language, though this time he attempted English words with the care of a man not used to speaking it. He told Ethan that he could leave if he wished. No one would force him to stay. The gesture was an offer of freedom, tempered by respect and understanding. Ethan's heart ached. He could leave, return to the familiar lands of his ranch, his routines, and the life he had always known. Yet to leave would be to abandon Nayeli, who had entrusted him with her life and her culture. Nayeli approached him, her eyes soft but serious. "If you go," she said, her words halting in English, "I will understand. But remember, you are always part of my people." Ethan could see the trust in her gaze, the quiet strength that had carried her through injury and fear. The thought of leaving her behind made him feel an unfamiliar sting of guilt and longing. His life had always been solitary, but in this brief time he had found a bond deeper than anything he had known before. The days that followed were filled with small but profound lessons. Ethan helped repair the roofs of the teepees before the next rain, assisted in tracking the movements of deer for the hunt, and learned to ride the horses in the unique way the Apache did. Silently, almost like part of the land itself, Nayeli remained close, guiding him, teaching him the subtleties of her people's ways. The connection between them grew, not through spoken words alone, but through shared experience, mutual respect, and quiet understanding. Each time he caught her smile, a spark of warmth spread through his chest. He had never expected to feel so protective, so responsible for another human being. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the camp, Ethan and Nayeli walked to the edge of the cliffs. She pointed to the horizon, gesturing at the land they now shared, then touched his arm gently. Ethan felt the weight of her trust, the invisible bond that had formed between them. He realized that his life would never return to the way it had been before. The solitude of the plains, the quiet of his own ranch, the freedom of a lone man, all of it seemed distant, almost irrelevant. Here, in the midst of a culture he was only beginning to understand, he had discovered loyalty, honor, and an unfamiliar, but compelling, sense of love. One day, while helping the young men track the horses, Ethan witnessed something that deepened his respect for the tribe. He saw their patience with animals, their quiet communication without words, their care for one another. Nayeli noticed his gaze and nodded, as if to say he was beginning to understand. Ethan realized that this life, though unfamiliar and demanding, carried a dignity and harmony that his solitary life never had. He had been brought here not by choice, but by fate, and he could not turn away from the responsibilities that now belonged to him. As the weeks passed, Ethan became part of the rhythm of the tribe. He helped build fires, prepared meals, and even assisted in teaching the children to ride and care for the horses. Nayeli remained his quiet companion, their connection deepening each day. The bond between them was subtle but undeniable, a mixture of respect, gratitude, and a gentle affection that neither spoke of openly, but both understood. He had started as a stranger who saved a life, but now he was a man intertwined with a community, a part of something far greater than himself. The story of the white man who had saved an Apache girl spread quietly through the camp. Ethan noticed the nods of approval, the smiles exchanged when he passed by, the way the children would wave at him and the young men would accept his guidance. He had become a bridge between worlds, a man of two lives, the world he had left behind and the world that had accepted him with open hearts. In those quiet moments, when the firelight danced across their faces and the stars filled the night sky, Ethan realized the depth of what he had experienced. Fate had led him to this canyon, to Nayeli, and to a life that demanded courage, patience, and honor. And in return it had given him a bond stronger than anything he had known before. The sun was beginning its slow descent over the jagged cliffs of the Arizona Canyon, painting the dry earth with deep oranges and reds. Ethan Cole, a tall man with a lean build and a face weathered by years under the open sky, guided his horse carefully along the narrow trail. He had spent most of the day delivering cattle to a neighboring ranch, and the ride back home promised the quiet peace he often cherished. Yet today the canyon felt different. The wind whispered in strange patterns and the distant cries of birds seemed uneasy. Ethan tightened his grip on the reins and scanned the cliffs, noticing shadows moving strangely in the fading light. Suddenly, a faint cry reached him, soft yet urgent, cutting through the usual sounds of the desert. Ethan's heart skipped. He could not ignore it. It sounded like someone in trouble. He stopped his horse and listened carefully. There it was again, a weak, trembling voice calling out almost like a plea. Without hesitation, he urged his horse forward, following the sound as it wound through the canyon's twisting paths. Each step of his horse stirred small clouds of dust that glimmered gold in the sunset. The trail narrowed, cliffs rising sharply on either side, but the sound guided him steadily. He moved cautiously, knowing that danger could be lurking anywhere. Then he saw her. A young Apache girl lay near a small creek that trickled through the canyon floor. Her clothes were torn and dirty. Her left arm bent awkwardly, with blood seeping through the fabric. Her long, dark hair was matted, and her eyes, wide, alert, and full of fear, met his as he approached. Ethan could see that she was exhausted, but there was something in her gaze that told him she was not completely helpless. She tried to push herself upright, but a sharp gasp of pain escaped her lips. The arrow or bullet wound on her arm was serious. Without a second thought, Ethan dismounted, tying his horse to a nearby bush, and hurried to her side. "Easy, easy," he said softly, kneeling beside her. He tore a strip from his own shirt, trying to make a bandage. His hands moved quickly but gently. The girl flinched, then relaxed slightly, allowing him to clean the wound. Water from the creek trickled into the cloth, cooling her raw skin. He poured a little water into her mouth, helping her drink. She coughed weakly, then nodded, showing that she understood his attempt to help. Her voice was hoarse, but she managed a few words in her own language. Ethan didn't understand them, but her gestures made it clear she was explaining what had happened. Ethan felt a pang of worry. He knew he could not stay here long. The canyon was dangerous, and the girl's tribe could be nearby. If they saw a stranger with her, they might think he had attacked her. Still, he could not leave her alone. The desert night would be merciless. He made a decision. Carefully, he lifted her onto the horse, supporting her weight, and held her close to steady her. Her trust was quiet but clear. She clung to him lightly, her small hand resting on his arm. Ethan's heart thumped in his chest. He had saved many cattle in his life, but never had he saved a human life in such a direct way, and certainly not a life so fragile and precious. The journey to her tribe's territory was slow and cautious. The sun dipped lower, and the shadows of the cliffs stretched long across the canyon. Ethan moved silently, every rustle of brush and snap of twigs making him tense. He imagined the dangers, the rival groups that had attacked her, wild animals, and the possibility of her own people mistaking him for an enemy. His hand rested lightly on his revolver, though he hoped it would never be needed. Nellie, as she later told him her name, leaned weakly against him, her dark eyes observing the desert quietly. They did not speak much, but there was a growing understanding between them, a connection formed not through words, but through shared struggle and human trust. As night fell, Ethan built a small fire in a safe clearing, careful not to let its light spill too far. He placed her gently beside the fire, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. She shivered, her body small against the cold desert air. He stayed close, keeping the fire alive, watching over her with a mixture of concern and a strange sense of duty he had never known before. The stars began to appear, scattered across the deep navy sky, and the world seemed vast and silent around them. Ethan felt the weight of responsibility. He was alone with this girl in unfamiliar land, and yet he could not imagine abandoning her. When riders appeared on the ridge above, he froze. Shadows of men moving in the moonlight were clearly armed. He whispered to Nellie to stay low, covering her with his coat. The men passed by without noticing them, and Ethan exhaled slowly. Relief washed over him, but he knew the night was not over. His mind raced with questions. What had happened to her? Why was she alone and wounded? And what would her tribe do if they discovered him here? Yet despite the uncertainty, he felt calm in one strange way. He had chosen to act, to help, and he knew it was the right thing. At dawn, the girl's wound looked slightly better. She stirred, her lips forming a faint, grateful smile. Ethan helped her to sit, and she pointed toward the distant mountains. Her gestures were clear. This was the way to her camp. With careful effort, he lifted her onto his horse again, supporting her as they moved slowly across the desert floor. The first light of day lit up the ridges, turning them into golden walls. Ethan felt a strange mix of pride and fear. He was bringing her home, but the unknown awaited him. Finally, they reached the edge of her tribe's territory. Warriors appeared, moving silently but with authority. They surrounded him, their bows and rifles ready. Ethan's heart pounded. He dismounted slowly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. Nellie, weak but determined, stepped forward slightly, motioning to Ethan and trying to explain. Her gestures and whispered words, though foreign to him, carried urgency and meaning. After tense moments, the chief, an older man named Taji, spoke to the warriors, and slowly the weapons lowered. Relief washed over Ethan, but it was short-lived. The warriors did not turn away. Instead, they motioned for him to follow deeper into the camp. Confused, he obeyed, carrying Nayeli carefully as they walked among the teepees and fire pits. The people watched silently. Finally, the chief took Ethan's hand and placed it gently on Nayeli's shoulder. Drums began to beat softly. Women brought small gifts, and Ethan realized they were performing some kind of ritual. The chief spoke words Ethan did not understand, and the tribe cheered. Nayeli looked up at him, her dark eyes bright with emotion, and whispered a phrase he could barely catch. Then it hit him. She called him her husband. Ethan's jaw went slack. He had never expected this. Saving her life had brought him into a bond he had not sought, in a culture he barely understood. The weight of it pressed on him, and yet in that moment he felt a strange sense of honor and responsibility. He had acted from compassion, and now fate had placed him in a story much larger than himself. The girl, once weak and helpless, looked at him with trust and hope, and Ethan realized he could not turn away. Whatever lay ahead, he had stepped into a life that would change him forever. As night fell over the camp, the firelight flickered across the painted faces of the tribe. Ethan sat beside Nayeli, quiet but alert, knowing that this was only the beginning of a journey neither of them could have imagined. He had saved her life, but in doing so, he had entered a world that demanded courage, respect, and understanding, qualities he would need in abundance if he hoped to honor the bond that now tied them together. The desert night was still, the stars silent witnesses, and Ethan felt the weight and wonder of what had just happened.